Good morning. Super glad you're here. Hello to Sunnyvale and to the theater and to South Hills. Glad that you guys are with us as well. Before we get going, I would like to do something. If you would allow us, if you are a veteran here or you are a family member of a veteran, would you stand and allow us to honor you, please? Stand among us and in the venues as well. Thank you. Thanks, man. Thank you. Wow, thank you. Awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you for your sacrifice, and we enjoy the benefits of freedom because of your service. We've been working our way through the book of James, and we find ourselves now almost done with the book. We're in chapter 5, and there's been a storm brewing in James's writing. As you've been reading along, we've challenged one another to try to read James through once a week as we're continuing to work our way through it. It's not too late to stop, or don't stop doing that. Keep doing it. We got a couple of weeks left, but as you read it, you hear like as early as verse 10 in chapter 1, where he says, "But the one who is rich should take pride in his low position." And he starts to talk about those who have and those who have not. And he says that it shows up in terms of how we treat one another. It shows up in terms of how we are tempted. It shows up in terms of how we even talk. And how we make our plans in our business. In chapter 4, we talked about these things. And finally, in chapter 5, he's going to kind of hit us with the hammer. James is always like really forthright, but the first 6 verses of chapter 5 are actually come across as probably the most harsh section in the book, as he's going to talk to people about wealth. And I want to give you a clue about why it comes across that way. So let me pray for us. And also, I know that as I already mentioned money, and there's a preacher in money, some of y'all are like, throwing the walls up already, so let me pray for that as well. I promise you, or I assure you that is not what our intentions are. We're trying to preach chapter 5 of James, and you know where chapter 5 is? It's after chapter 4. And so we're just working our way through, and so we're going to do that together. Let me pray for us, and we'll jump in. Father, thank you for the opportunity to gather. Thank you for the people in the room, in all of the venues that have sacrificially given so that we can enjoy the freedoms that we have. Now, God, we don't want to take those freedoms for granted, and we want them to accomplish something in our lives. Since we've set aside this time and we're here, God, speak to us. Open some things up to us from your word that we might do exactly what James is challenging us to, is that to be people that what they say they believe and how they live are consistent. May our lives be consistent with the love of Jesus that we have embraced. And we ask it in his strong name and for his sake. Amen. All right, now, we've talked about this a little bit in week 1, but the context of the book of James is that James is the pastor. He's kind of the lead pastor in the church in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is the most difficult church to pastor in the first century for 3 reasons. One, it's the hub of the Jewish faith, and there's incredible Jewish persecution there. They do not want this Christian fledgling faith to gain any traction and stay around. So they've got that opposition. The second opposition is from the Roman Empire. They don't want it to be there either. And so they're saying, we don't want you to be here. And they're persecuting the most difficult. And Christians are being persecuted all over the Roman Empire. But it's probably safe to say that it's most intense and most difficult right there in Jerusalem in the first century. And James, who is the half-brother of Jesus, is taken on the mantle of being the lead guy there. And the third reason is this. We see from times in Scripture, Paul, if you're not familiar with it, Paul was a guy in the Scriptures who went out and started new churches. And he would go over to Corinth, and he would go over to Ephesus, and he'd go into places and cities in Macedonia, and into Greece, and to Turkey, and eventually in Rome. And he would go those places, he would start churches. And then when he got arrested, he was sitting in prison and didn't have anything to do, he would write those guys letters. And we see from his letters that he's very concerned about the church in Jerusalem because of a very severe famine that's going on. We see him talking about the poverty in Jerusalem in 1 Corinthians, which is written about 53 or 54 AD. Then you go all the way to the book of Romans, which is written in like 57, 58 AD, and he's still writing about that famine in Jerusalem. So we're not talking about they had a bad year. We're talking about they had a bad several years back to back. And so James is not only under intense religious persecution from the Jews and political persecution from the Romans, but he's also in this environment where they haven't seen rain in possibly 3 or 4 or 5 years. He's part of a community that's meeting every week, and people are dying from this. And then he begins with this warning in chapter 5, verse 1. And it's difficult to read. It's difficult to read. It says, now listen, you rich people. Now, let me stop right there. First, you can see on the screens that if it's in bold, that means that it's an imperative command, or it's in the imperative sense. So I did this so that you could see the first 6 verses, he's really just kind of ranting. He's not really telling anybody to do anything. Bless you. But in the next verses, starting at verse 7, you'll see all kinds of bold commands in terms of what we're supposed to do. So he's describing a situation in the first 6 verses. Listen, you rich people. And he also says that phrase is strange, you rich people. Usually when he says, now listen up, he says, now listen, brothers. Pay attention, brothers and sisters. Let me tell you something here, family of God. Many people believe that these 6 verses are written to people who are not even Christians. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but it definitely has a harsh tone to it as he talks to the rich. Listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming upon you. Your wealth is rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver have corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you have failed to pay. The workmen who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. And this is a pretty particular term. Lord Almighty, it sounds normal to us, but the word for there on Almighty is actually Sabaoth. And it means host, armies. It's the Lord of heaven's armies. So he uses a particular name for God. It's one of strong. It will one day make things right. Now remember, this is a pastor who's watching his congregation die. And so he uses this dark language. Your flesh is being corroded. Your clothes are getting eaten up and all these kinds of things. But he's seeing these people that have put their hope in the wealth that they have while everybody else is suffering. And he's saying there's going to be a day when it gets made right. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered innocent men who were not even opposing you. And then the mood changes. The mood changes in verse 7. And he starts to give us a lot of the commands about how, if you are in this situation and you're one of the have-nots. He's spoken to the haves, now he speaks to the have-nots. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains. Can you imagine hearing that? when you were a part of a community that hadn't seen rain in several years? You haven't seen a crop? You too, be patient, stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against each other, brothers, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. As an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we consider blessed those who persevered. We've heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of mercy and compassion. So he begins to draw on their knowledge. Remember, he's writing primarily to Jewish Christians, people who were in the Jewish faith that have converted to this message of Jesus. They would be very familiar with the prophets and their example. And he says, remember them. We count them as blessed among us. As you know, above all, verse 12, above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. Let your yes be yes and your no, no, or you will be condemned. Now, he's speaking to a group of people who some people that have and some people that have not. And what's going to happen is that in this passage, what James actually decides is that the poor among them are defined. And here's the poor. The poor are those who can't miss a check. They cannot miss one check. Remember what he said? You have withheld the wages of the poor. And that puts them in dire straits. That puts them in opposition to you. So what would it look like? And again, this is difficult for us to kind of get our hands around because I don't have all the financial records of what we do here at Westgate. Those who are a part of this, the app's going to give that to me soon, but you don't know that yet. So. No, just kidding. That's not going to do it. But so I've got to go on average American numbers to be able to do this. And average American numbers are numbers for Santa Clara County. So there's a survey or some results that came out in the San Jose Mercury News lately. And they showed that this is the survey, but I want to break it down a little bit. So I want to show you that first, Santa Clara County has the highest median annual income average of anywhere in the state and anywhere in the country. $96,310 is the median salary for a household here in our county. Now, that doesn't really help us. I mean, that's what it is, but they've come up with something called a a self-sufficiency standard. And this is poverty levels are different everywhere in the United States. You can see the federal poverty level is a little over $20,000. Well, that's not going to cut it here by a long shot. So what they've done is with cost of living and housing and all those kinds of things, these are the numbers for the different counties and stuff that are going on. Santa Clara County is right there. The self-sufficiency standard is $62,600. $62,600. And by what this seems to point to me is basically these are the people, if you make as a household, you make less than that, you can't miss a check. With me? And that's how James would define the poor. Now, I know nobody in this room's average, that this is just our county. But also it tells us how many of us in our county averaged out, how many of us are below $62,000? And that survey also showed us that. And it is this orange line that's in the middle. You see the orange line in the middle in Santa Clara County, percentage of people below the self-sufficiency standard with a family of 3, and it's 30% of us. So if we are indicators of the county we live in, and I believe that's probably a fair argument, then 30% of us would be those who can't miss a check. Are you following my reasoning? How I'm trying to bridge 2,000 years here about what James would say, those who are the poor and then those who are the rich. So you do your own math. We are not going to ask you to raise your hand or do that in the campuses and the venues anywhere. But you can just kind of do your own math. As James writes this letter, he's writing it to those who have and to those who have not. And it seems to me a fair way of us looking at this is about 30% of us, could be a little more, could be a little less, 30% of us are those who he would consider or classify in our culture poor. Now, what does he say? What does he say to us there? Well, in the first 6 verses, he says all kinds of weird, dark things, but I think what he's saying to the rich, or to the approximately 70% of us, if that's fair, if you're following me, he would say resist 2 things. Resist 2 things. If these 2 things get in your life, they are going to eat the joy away from you. It's not going to literally be corrosion of your flesh, but it will literally suck the life out of your soul. The first one is greed. Resist greed. He speaks of people who are hoarding, holding things to themselves. Christ forbids this in Luke chapter 12, but this is like this selfishness, this hoarding, that even though all around you there's a community of people who are hurting, your mind is only on yourself and what you can keep. He says the second thing that you need to make sure you resist is that you resist injustice. You don't allow your resources to be part of something that advances unjust practices. You pay fair wages. You don't withhold wages. God actually hears the prayers of those who are treated poorly. So you resist these 2 things. You resist greed and you resist injustice. And you've got to do a kind of an evaluation of your own life, asking yourselves, are there areas in my life where this would show up? And this takes time. This is not an easy thing to do. We don't know a lot about the manufacturers of the goods that we have. But some of that you can find out. And if you're purchasing from someone or a company of someone's who is completely unjust in how they treat their workers, you might consider adjusting where you spend your money. Those kinds of things would be the process there of not only greed, but fighting injustice. But he says there's some other things, that there are 4 things that we should do. 4 things that we should do, and they seem strange to me. He's talking to primarily people that are wrestling with their finances. This is some things that it seems strange. Particularly, he's talking to the have-nots in these 4 things. He says, instead, you need to make sure that you're patient. Be patient. Outrage might be a thing that you could, live with. The gap between the haves and the have-nots in our county is gigantic. I mean, you all know this. If we've got a median income of $96,000 and people are living below $60,000, what must the top end be? And that gap, it's easy if you're on the have-not scale to just be completely outraged by what's going on. And he's saying here, no, be patient in this thing. There is hope. God is hearing your prayers. He will provide. Stay faithful to the principles. Don't leave the principles so that you can sell out to get into the haves. He also says to stand firm. These 2 terms, be patient and stand firm, sound passive. But they are not passive. He gives as an example the prophets who are very active in what they were doing. And he's saying in these 2 things, continue active in the faith, follow the principles that you've embraced to be true, and be patient and stand firm. And while you're doing that, don't grumble. This seems like a very strange command, but he's saying to you, those of you who have less, don't grumble about that, especially among the brothers. Very particular wording that he gives. Don't grumble in the church. Don't all sit around together in your life group and just talk about what you don't have. This word is a very interesting word. It's translated groan and sigh many more times than it is grumble. And when I think of this word, I think of Eeyore. Okay? He's just saying, man, you've got the hope of Christ in you. You've got the promise of heaven ahead of you. Don't be a bunch of Eeyores talking about, the housing market and all the tech companies and blah, blah, blah. Okay? That's all true, but I mean, all of that griping, what's that really going to do for you? It's just going to drag your spirit down. And then the last one that he gives us, the last advice that he gives us is don't swear. Now, this is not talking about don't cuss. We had that conversation. James already talked about cussing 2 weeks ago. We had that conversation. If you missed it, it was interesting. Go back and take a look at it. But this one is not swear. All the commentaries believe that what he's talking about here is an oath. Don't swear an oath. You can imagine that if you're poor in the first century and there's opportunities to get work, you might overpromise what you can do and say things that you really can't accomplish. You're just trying to somehow get work. In fact, there was a practice where you could swear an oath, and it was called bondservants. Paul, actually, I mentioned Paul earlier, he introduces himself several times in several of the letters that he writes. He says, Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ. What that meant was, I'm a voluntary slave. I've given an oath, and I've decided I will work for your house for, say, 10 years. You make sure you feed my family, I'm your slave for 10 years. You actually got a special earring in the Roman culture that said you're a voluntary slave. It's not mandated to you. You chose it. And many times if you were a slave in a good family and that family treated you well, at the end of your time for slavery, you were able to get out of it. Rather than claim your freedom, you would just voluntarily say, I'll stay. And I'm sure that would have been a temptation here. You mortgage, listen to this, you mortgage the future and you say goodbye to your dreams because it's so desperate right now that you give an oath. You make a pledge. You wrap yourself, and we do this. We don't literally go up and swear our oaths, but we sign mortgages. We sign papers. We enter into contracts. And he's saying, be careful not to do this. Just let your yes be yes and your no be no. And he's actually quoting Jesus here. Jesus in Matthew chapter 5, verse 37, he says exactly the same thing that James says. Simply let your yes be yes and your no, no. Now, this conversation is helpful for us because I think it's good for you to understand economically who the Bible is speaking to. And you can hear things like, if you make $25,000, you're in the top 5% of the wealth of the world. If you make $25,000 annually, you're in the top 5% of the wealth of the world. But we've already seen that barely puts us above the poverty line in America. You don't live in Ethiopia. The housing market that you have is not somewhere in South Africa. It's here. And so I think it's important for you to understand what's going on and what the scriptures are actually asking of you. Please don't take this as a slap or anything detrimental, but some of you are living in what the scriptures would say, check to check. And the things that are asked of you in the scriptures are different than those that are asked of the rich. Now, if the numbers are true and 30% of us live at the self-sufficiency standard or below, that also has there's another part of that equation you understand, right? And that's 70% of us. What would the scriptures ask of 70% of us? So let me just take some time here and I want to walk you through several things that the scriptures teach from beginning to end about finances. Now I know that there's I can feel it in the room. It's not normally here. You are resistant to this. You don't like that I'm talking to you about money. And there could be 100 reasons why. And there's good precedent to not trust preachers talking about money. You don't have to go very far in the current events to say, whoa. Okay, so let me give let me try to disarm this a little bit. First, if you feel like in any time when I'm talking about things, if you feel like I'm manipulating you or trying to work you to give your money, don't ever give. In fact, let me just say this. If you ever feel like someone's manipulating you for your money, don't give to that person. Why would you give to someone who's manipulating you? Don't ever give. Here at Westgate, if you feel like I'm pressuring you, and I'm doing anything other than just informing you about what the scriptures teach. Secondly, if you're new here, and I've met some folks that are new with great first names, Steve. If you happen to be new here, you don't know us, you don't trust us. You should never give money to people you don't trust. Y'all have heard me say this 100 times. That's bad stewardship. That's just dumb. Why would you give money to people you don't trust? So we would never expect you to give here until you know us and trust us. So if you're new here, you're off the hook. And then if you're here and you're just checking out the Christian faith and somebody invited you here and you're not really sure even, you're surprised that you're here still too. But we're glad to have you here, and this is a great place to hear about the Christian message. But why would a non-Christian ever give to the Christian cause? We don't expect you to, nor do we think you should. Unless you want to help us feed the poor or something, you could maybe do that, and that'd be great, but just out of your kindness. But you shouldn't give to a Christian organization if you're a non-Christian. So let me give you one more. The fourth disarm is this. This talk that I'm just about to give you this information, it should not change the offering one dime. Because what I'm about to tell you, you should have already prepared in advance to biblically give today. You should already have known before you came in what you're going to give. And if you're waiting for me to stir some guilt so you can pull out an extra 20, you hadn't helped us that much, and God is not impressed. That is not biblical giving. And James is saying, if you claim to be a follower of Jesus, don't just talk it. Don't just hear it. Do it. And Jesus talked about the rich, and the Bible talks more about the rich than you would actually imagine. You know, the word rich shows up 62 times in the Bible. Now, to put that in context, hell only shows up 14 times. Drunk only shows up 8 times. In the NIV, sex only shows up twice. So there's a lot to be said about this, and most of us in the room, based on statistics that I've shared with you, most of us in the other rooms, we are the rich. Now, what would they say? What would the scriptures teach to the rich? 1, earn money ethically. Earn money ethically. God's view towards your vocation is that it is sacred. If what you do is legal, it doesn't matter if it's white collar, blue collar, if you're graduate degreed or no degreed. If what you do as unto the Lord is viewed as sacred, earn it ethically. Honor God in the workplace. Proverbs 11:1, the Lord hates cheating, but he delights in honesty. Number 2, spend money wisely. Spend money wisely. Proverbs 21:5 says, the plans of the diligent lead surely to advantage, but everyone who is hasty comes surely to poverty. To spend money wisely, it means with thought long term. Not just in the spur of the moment, just impulse buying, but to give thought about what's going on. The scriptures teach consistently from cover to cover to use your resources wisely. Number 3, avoid destructive debt. Now, I'm not teaching that all debt is wrong, but there is a particular debt that is destructive. And Romans 13 says that there should be no debt remaining in us except for love. And the destructive debt I'm mostly referring to is credit card debt. Now, again, I've already acknowledged that we're not average. I know the people watching are not average, but I've only got average numbers. So let me use those numbers, even though I acknowledge y'all ain't average. The average American has $6,500 of credit card debt. $6,500 of credit card debt. And some of y'all are going like, wow, that's way too much. And some of y'all are going, man, I only wish I had that much, okay? Because that's the average number. Now, watch this. Here in this room, over in our theater and all our venues, if we take the average number of debt and we multiply it by our attenders, by our people who are here today, our cumulative credit card debt as a community, just us, Westgate, just us, is $19,500,000. We have lived, the air that we breathe, the financial air that we breathe, is to spend more than you have. And that is destructive. In 2017, as a country, we reached actually a new financial milestone. 2017, we exceeded $1 trillion of credit card debt as a nation. If you are in a situation where you have credit card debt that is carried over month to month and you're just making payments on that and you're not reducing that to zero every month, I would say it needs to be priority one in your finances in terms of how to get that stuff under control. Next is to save money consistently. Proverbs 6 talks about the ant that works in the summertime to save stuff for the winter, that there's a time of have and then there's going to be a time of scarcity, and that you should save for that time. And that is not what we do here. It's amazing. 22% of Americans only have $100 or less in a savings account. 22%. Be trying to work where you can put some money aside, where you save money consistently. 2 more. Give money generously to the poor. Give money to the poor generously. You know, if you're under intense credit card debt and you're not saving any money, it's super hard to be generous. And over again, the scriptures would say things like Proverbs 19. He who is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will reward him for what he has done. Proverbs 11:25. A generous man will prosper. He who refreshes others will himself be refreshed. That if you are under a constant pressure of check to check, it's very hard to be generous. If you are under the constant pressure of credit card debt where you've overspent, it's very hard to be generous. Now, I think this is pretty timely for you. You're about to go in, it was mentioned about Black Friday is coming up soon. You're about to go into an intense time of retail pressure. In fact, you're about to spend money you don't have on people you don't like that much. And you might consider some of these principles that the scriptures teach to us. One last one, tithe money to the house of God to support the ministry you're in. Now, I've already let you off the hook if you're new or if you're below the self-sufficiency line. I actually believe that about 50% of us, 50 to maybe 55% of us who attend on a regular basis probably don't and shouldn't give. But some should. And those of you who can, should. In fact, Malachi chapter 3 says that if you don't tithe, you're cheating God. You're cheating God. Now, Steve, when you say tithe, do you mean 10%? No, I don't mean 10%. In fact, tithe means literally 10. But in the scriptures, in the Hebrew scriptures, the Hebrew folks had 3 tithes, which equaled almost 30%. Now, that's an amazing figure that they tithe when you figure they were, under the Roman government especially, they were like a 50 or a 60% tax bracket. And they were still being asked to give 3 tithes. And so I don't believe 10% is a special number necessarily for everyone to do. I actually believe that some people in the room that are making $62,000 or less, they should never give 10% of their income. They can't pay their bills if they were to give away that much money. Maybe you should give one. There are people in the room that they're going to do their budget and they're going to look at it and say, I can give $100 next year and God will be pleased. And then there's a bunch of us that should give a lot more than that. How do you figure out how much your percentage should be? Well, it's actually quite an easy equation that you cannot do on the fly. You have to sit down and think about this and pray about it. That's why the offering today should not change at any of our campuses, anywhere. It should not change. You've got to balance sacrifice with joy. Sacrifice and joy. You've got to work that out. Some of you right now, your giving habits, you've got a lot of sacrifice and very little joy. I mean, in fact, I can almost hear you groan when we pass the baskets. You're so glad to give online now because you no longer have to write that check and groan while you're doing it. A lot of sacrifice, but no joy. And I'm going to tell you, God's not impressed. That's not the kind of giver he wants. And then there's some of y'all, honestly, you got like tons of joy. Tons of joy. But there ain't no sacrifice. You don't miss what you give. You don't miss it a lick. And sacrifice means it costs you something. So you've got to look at it, and that's why it takes time. Sit down with your budget. Sit down with all the people who make decisions in your family, if there is one, and you decide, okay, what can we give? And you push, we can give 2%, maybe 3%. Okay, I'm still happy about that. Okay, land there for a while. Dana and I go back and evaluate ours all the time. Dana taught me more about this than any other person. We just got married. I had never been in a church in my life. And I bring home my very first check on a teaching salary, and she says, we're going to tithe on this. And I'm like, tithe? Like, what's 10% tithe? She said, I think we should do that. We discussed and cussed a little bit, and then she won, and we wrote it out, and it was the thing that we could do. And we were able to do that. We learned that principles early. If you're here thinking, I'll tithe when I get a lot of money, you probably won't. We started tithing when we were way under that 20 grand poverty line. One income, my wife in college still as a teacher in the South. So balancing sacrifice and joy, and it's not that everybody should give the same amount. It's just it's not equal gifts, but equal sacrifice. Listen to this verse in 2 Corinthians 8. I love the balance of the scriptures. And he's talking about the offering that's going to go to Jerusalem. And Paul says to the people in Corinth, which, by the way, Corinth is a giant city, about 400,000 people, and they are flourishing. They are killing it. They're right on the trade route and killing it. And he says, finish the work that you were so eager to do. May it be matched by your completion of it, according to your means. Now watch. For if the willingness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what one does not have. If you have a gift and you're willing, and it's based on what you have. So the person next to you might give completely different. It may have way less zeros or way more zeros on the end of it than yours does. It doesn't matter. The greatest picture of this in the New Testament with Jesus is when he's standing at the offering. Imagine Jesus if we had a place where everybody brought their offering and it was in coin. So he could just sit there and, you put in 4. You only put in 3. One little widow gal comes in and she brings the smallest denomination of coin that there is and drops 2 of them in. And then this rich dude walks up and just kind of had to bring it in a basket and dumps all of this stuff in. And he says, I tell you the truth. Only one person really gave. And it was the widow. Jesus doesn't want your money because he needs it. He wants to be a part of every area of your life. And that includes your financial decisions. And James would say, if you say that you've embraced the death of Christ for the forgiveness of sins, then every aspect of your life should line up to that reality. How you speak, how you treat others, how you view those that are different than you, and certainly how you spend. May God give us the grace to live in that consistent way. Let's pray together. God, we're grateful for your word and the clarity of it. And I pray for those of us in the room who are your children and you are nudging for us to pay attention to something, that you would have your way. Release some people from the guilt they feel for things that they really cannot and should not do. And then God convict some in the room from the apathy they have with how their finances are used. Help them to see all the great good that can come. And bless them with a generous heart. Have your way in us, we ask. In Christ's name, amen.